everyone, welcome back to chemistry. In this video, I just wanted to do a quick overview of chemistry lab notebook guidelines, just to give you a little bit of a sense of what I'm expecting in terms of lab notebooks. So lab notebooks are a really important and useful tool for any experiments that you conduct. They're a place to store your data and your observations, any measurements that you take, stuff like that. So we have a few guidelines, and I'm not going to go through everything. I'll let you read this on your own, but I will highlight some of the really important stuff. The first thing you need to do is you need to go out and you need to get a lab notebook. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but it does need to be stitch bound. My recommendation is that you buy a composition book, just something simple. You can get it from Dollar Tree or Walmart or Target. It shouldn't cost you too much money. Just as long as it's stitch bound and not spiral bound, that's acceptable for lab. Another big one is that any information that you write in your lab notebook must be written in ink, no pencil. This specifically says that they want blue or black ink. I'm not super particular about that. Just as long as it's not in pencil, I'm all right with that. If you want to use highlighters or different color inks just to differentiate between different parts in your lab notebook, that's totally fine. The reason that we don't want pencil is because pencil can get washed away. So if you spill anything on your lab notebook and all of your data is in pencil, it's going to be gone and you won't be able to retrieve it. So gotta use ink. Another one is don't use whiteout for mistakes. My biggest tip is just to, if you notice any of your data is incorrect, or you did your calculations wrong, or you wrote down the wrong number, just draw one line through your previous data and write the correct information to the right of it. And the reason for this is that sometimes we convince ourselves that we took our data wrong, and then we realize, oh, actually, no, that data was correct. And we want to be able to go back and use that data if we need to. I would leave a few pages blank at the beginning of your lab notebook just so that you have room on your table of contents. If your lab notebook doesn't have page numbers on the pages, go ahead and write them. Either this says in the upper corner, but you can write them anywhere. I'm just going to highlight page numbers. I like to do this as I go, so as I conduct experiments, I just write, at the bottom of the page or the top of the page or something. I write my page number. That way I can write it in my table of contents, experiment 3 is on page 4, whatever, and you can easily reference it. Another big one is don't remove pages from your lab notebook. Again, sometimes we convince ourselves that we did something wrong and we actually were right the first time. I don't know if that happens to you, but it happens to me all the time. So you want to be able to reference that data if you need to. So don't rip any pages out of your lab notebook. And then, ideally we want our lab notebooks to be as clear, neat, and well organized as possible. I can be a little lenient with this in the beginning of the quarter. It's a learning curve, takes some time to get used to this. But as you get towards the end of the quarter, I will expect that your lab notebook gets better and better. All right, so there are generally about 3 steps for lab, or 3 kind of parts of lab. There's the pre-lab, which is what you do before you come to lab, right? Pre-lab. There's the lab, which is what you do in lab. And then there's the post-lab, which is what you do after lab, or post-lab. So the pre-lab needs to be written in your notebook before you come to lab. This is really, really important. Think of it as your ticket into the lab. If you don't have your pre-lab written in your notebook, you are not prepared for that lab. This is a safety concern. So I'm a little bit of a stickler about this. If you don't have your pre-lab written in your notebook before you come to lab, I'll have you sit down and write your pre-lab before you can start the lab. All right, so some of the things that you need to have in your pre-lab are listed here. Okay, so we always want to have the title of our experiment. We want the date that we conducted the experiment. We want to make sure that we write down who our lab partner was, give them credit for also conducting the experiment, right? We want to write the purpose of the lab. The purpose and observations / data. Both of these things you want to check your lab handout for. So what do I mean by that? So for the purpose of the lab, this is just a really quick statement about what the objective of your experiment is. Why are we conducting this experiment? What's the goal here? So check your lab handout for that. You also want to check your lab handout for the observations and data part. Of course, you're not going to be writing any observations or taking any data down because you haven't conducted the experiment, but you want to make sure that you have your data tables prepped so that when you come into lab, you can just go ahead and write down any data that you take right in that table. And a lot of times your lab handout, I will actually give you some data tables that you can copy into your lab notebook. All right, and then something that I want to highlight here is that in this first sentence here, under observations and data, it says you don't need to write a detailed procedure for each experiment in your lab notebook. You can use your lab manual for that, okay? But you are required to have any necessary data tables prepared and answer any questions. All right, and then I want to draw your attention back here for a second. I don't want you to write down every single word the procedure says in your lab handout, but I do want you to have a general idea of what you're doing and the step-by-step process for the experiment. So it's a good idea to write bullet points of your procedure. All right, I do want to just make a quick amendment here. We used to have an actual lab manual for Chem 121, but we wanted to reduce the amount of things that you guys had to carry here and purchase. So now we have handouts. So I'm gonna write handouts here and cross out manual. Okay, so it's gonna be in your lab. Oh, sorry, lab handout. In your lab handout. So bring your lab handout with you to class, to lab. All right, and then another one that's really important, so I'm going to star it, is safety and disposal. Any hazards associated with any chemicals that you're using will be written in your lab handout, and you need to copy those into your lab notebook. I know it feels like an extra step, but we do this so that you have that information right next to you while you're conducting the experiment, and also because there are a lot of studies that show when you write something down, you memorize it better. So write any specific safety hazards, disposal procedures, anything like that you want to have in your lab notebook. All right, so during lab, once you get to lab, at the very beginning of lab, I'll have a pre-lab lecture. It'll usually take about 15 to 30 minutes. If you are late enough to lab that you miss that pre-lab lecture, you will not be permitted to conduct the experiment. Okay, that's a safety concern. If you miss the pre-lab lecture, you're missing all of the important information about safety hazards and disposal, proper ways to handle different lab equipment, and it just becomes a safety concern. So if you are that late to lab that you miss the pre-lab lecture, I will not let you stay in lab. It's not because I'm mad at you. It's not because I don't like you. It's just because it is a safety concern for you and for those around you. So make sure you get to lab on time with your lab notebook ready to go, and you should be good to go. And then post-labs are always going to be due 1 week after lab. All right, and then another part of the post-labs that students often kind of forget about is the discussion section. And I'll remind you, if you miss it for the first lab, I'll probably email you and say, hey, you missed your discussion questions, just be sure to fill those out next time. So don't stress too much about that, but I do expect you to do them, especially as the quarter progresses. Okay, and this is just listing kind of the problems and errors, so any problems that you might have encountered in lab, and what you learned from the experiment. And then the next one for pre-lab notebook, that's just making sure that you have your pre-lab filled out. I actually call that lab notebook checks. And you should already see an assignment for this in Canvas. You don't need to do anything on Canvas for it. It's something that I fill in. The assignment is just there to remind me to give you a grade for it. All right, and then the post-lab is always going to be worth 10 points. All right, and then you've just got this kind of sample lab notebook entry. So this can help you out as you're filling out your first pre-lab. So notice that this is the Penny's lab. So we've actually kind of done the first pre-lab for you. So you want the title of the experiment, you want the date that you're going to conduct it. Obviously, it's not going to be the same date. You're going to write your lab partner's name once you know it. The purpose is found in your lab handout, but you can also write down something like this. Data and observations, there's already a nice data table actually written out for you, so you can copy that into your lab notebook. And then, as always, a safety and disposal section. All right, I hope that helps a little bit in learning how to fill out your lab notebook. If you have any questions, of course, always feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll try to get your questions answered. All right, have a good rest of your day.